day my brother got married, I paid for almost everything. The venue deposit, the catering, the flowers, the open bar. And he still found a way to make me feel like I didn't belong there. It wasn't one big moment. It was 100 small ones. The way his new wife rolled her eyes when I suggested a seating arrangement. The way my mother kept saying, "Your brother has a lot on his plate right now," whenever I brought up being reimbursed for something. The way my brother himself would clap me on the shoulder and say, "You're the best, you know that," in this tone that made it sound less like a compliment and more like a reminder of my function. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this actually started. My brother is 3 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one our parents held up as the example. Not because he was smarter or more driven, but because he was louder about his ambitions. He had this energy that filled a room, and our parents mistook it for potential. I was quieter. I kept my head down, studied, got a full scholarship to a state school while my parents took out a second mortgage to cover his tuition at a university he eventually dropped out of after 2 years. I didn't say anything about the mortgage. I figured it wasn't my business. I was 18, focused on my own path. I got a degree in accounting, passed my CPA exam on the first try, and by 26 I was making decent money at a firm in Atlanta. Nothing glamorous, but stable. Consistent. I had a 401k. I was building something. My brother spent those same years launching businesses. A food truck that lasted 4 months. An app idea he paid a developer $8,000 to build and then abandoned. A drop shipping store. A crypto thing I never fully understood. Each time he had a story about why it didn't work out, and each time our parents would say things like, "He just hasn't found his lane yet," or "Some people take longer to hit their stride." He was 31 when he met his girlfriend. She was fine. I want to be fair here. She was never outright cruel to me in those early months. She was just indifferent in the way some people are, when they've already decided you're not interesting. She worked part-time at a boutique and was working on what she called her wellness brand. From what I could tell, it was a combination of Instagram posts, expensive activewear, and a Substack newsletter that had maybe 300 subscribers. They got engaged after 8 months. My parents were thrilled. I was happy for my brother. Genuinely. I called him the night he told me, and I meant every word when I said I was glad he'd found someone. What I didn't know then, what I would find out in pieces over the next 18 months, was that the wedding planning was going to become my financial responsibility by default. It started small. My brother called me 2 weeks after the engagement and asked if I could spot him the venue deposit. Just a loan, he said, just until his business picked up. He was working on something new, a consulting venture, he said, though I never got a clear picture of what exactly he was consulting on. The deposit was $3,500. I sent it. A month later, my mother mentioned that the caterer required a 30% down payment and that my brother was a little stretched. Could I cover it? I'd be paid back from the wedding gift money, she said. People always give cash at weddings. I covered it. That was $4,200. I told myself each time that this was just me helping family get through a rough patch. I have the savings. They needed it. That's what you do. What I didn't fully let myself see was the pattern. Every conversation about the wedding eventually circled back to me. The florist, the photographer, the rehearsal dinner, the hotel block for out-of-town guests that my brother had promised people without confirming the rate first, leaving him owing a $1,200 difference when the block wasn't fully reserved. I covered it. By the time the wedding was 6 weeks out, I had put in just over $22,000. I had a rough accounting of it in a spreadsheet, not because I planned to demand it back, but because I'm an accountant. Tracking numbers is just how my brain works. My brother knew I was keeping track. At one point, he laughed about it on the phone and said, "You and your spreadsheets." And I laughed too because I didn't know what else to do. His fiancée never once thanked me. Not a text, not a phone call, not an acknowledgement at the engagement party. She called me by the wrong name, twice in front of people. Not my name, some other name. Like I wasn't worth the effort of memorizing. And my brother corrected her but then moved on so fast it was like it hadn't happened. I told myself she was stressed. Planning a wedding is stressful. I gave her grace. I probably should have been saving for myself. The wedding was on a Saturday in April. It was at a vineyard outside the city, which was my brother's fiancée's choice. Beautiful place. Rolling hills, white tents, string lights, the kind of venue that photographs well and costs accordingly. I was a bridesmaid, the only one from my brother's side of the family, which in hindsight should have told me something about how I was being positioned. not as his sister, as a prop. The morning went fine. Hair and makeup with the other bridesmaids, none of whom I knew well. They were all her friends, and they had a shorthand with each other that made me feel like I was watching a show I hadn't seen the earlier seasons of. I smiled and stayed out of the way and told myself it didn't matter. The ceremony was beautiful. I cried a little, which embarrassed me. I don't know why. Maybe because I still loved my brother despite everything. Maybe because I'd wanted this day to feel uncomplicated, and it almost did, for those 20 minutes under the arbor. Then came the reception. We were maybe an hour in. Dinner had just been served. The toasts were done. When I heard it, my brother's new wife was at the head table with a group of her friends, and I was close enough to hear without being part of the conversation. She was talking about me, not by name. She never used my name. But the context was unmistakable. She was describing me as the practical one, the way someone says practical when they mean boring. And then she said it. Some people can't help needing to be the one who saves the day. Like they have nothing else going for them, so they just pay for things. It's almost sad. Her friends laughed. One of them glanced over at me. She'd seen me close by, and then looked away. I sat there for a moment. The food on my plate went blurry. I could hear the band starting up behind me, something slow and pretty, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the music could keep playing like that. My mother was across the room. She hadn't heard. My father was talking to someone from the groom's side. Nobody was looking at me. I picked up my phone. I opened my banking app. I had set up 2 separate scheduled transfers earlier in the week, because my brother had asked me to, because he said it would help with cash flow timing. One for $3,000 to cover the final balance on the bar tab, and one for $1,800 for the day of coordination fee the venue charged separately. Both were set to process that night. I canceled both. It took maybe 45 seconds. I put my phone face down on the table and picked up my fork. I didn't make a scene. I didn't say a word to anyone. I just sat there and finished my dinner while the band played something I didn't recognize. And I let myself feel, for the first time in 2 years, like I was allowed to stop. It was my brother who found out first. The venue coordinator pulled him aside about 20 minutes later. Something about a payment flag on the account. And I watched his face change from across the room. He found me almost immediately. He crouched down next to my chair, and his voice was low, but there was something tight in it. "Did you cancel the transfers?" "I did." He looked at me for a second. "Why would you do that tonight, on my wedding night?" I looked at him steadily. Why would she say what she said tonight, on her wedding night? He went very still. "I was standing right there," I said. "I'm not invisible, even if she treats me like I am." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "How much was it?" $4,800. Add it to the $22,000 you already owe me, and we can talk about a payment plan whenever you're ready. I don't think he'd ever heard me say a number that directly before. He blinked. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. Then he stood up and walked away. What came next was not quiet. Within the hour, my mother found me. Her face was the expression she reserves for situations where she believes I am being unreasonable. A kind of exhausted disappointment. Like I've let her down by having a spine. She sat across from me and said in a careful voice, "Your brother says there was some kind of mix-up with the payments." "There wasn't a mix-up." "He said you canceled them." "I did." She looked at me like she was waiting for me to explain myself, to apologize, to offer some softer version of events that would let her comfort both of us at once. When I didn't, she said, "Tonight is not the time." "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't say anything. I just stopped the transfers. That's all. The venue could charge a late fee, then he can pay it." She flinched a little. I think it was the first time I'd said anything that direct to her in years. Maybe ever. "You've been so good about helping," she said. Then, after a pause, "I don't understand why you're doing this." I told her what his wife had said. I kept my voice even. I watched my mother's face as I said it. Watched her decide, in real time, whether to be angry on my behalf or to find a reason why it wasn't that bad. She chose the second one. She was probably just venting. My mother said, "She didn't know you could hear." "I know she didn't," I said. "That's the point." My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I hope you won't let this ruin the day." I almost laughed. I had paid for most of the day. I almost laughed. I had paid for most of the day. I was pretty sure I wasn't the one ruining it. My father found me about 20 minutes later. He was more direct than my mother. That's always been his way. He sat down across from me and said, "I heard there's a payment issue." "Not an issue," I said. "A decision." He tilted his head slightly. My father has always understood financial logic better than emotional logic, so I gave it to him straight. I told him the total. I told him I'd been asked for money every month for a year and a half. I told him I'd been happy to help because I loved my brother, but that I was not going to keep funding a life for someone who publicly mocked me as a charity case. My father was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I didn't know it had gotten that high." 22,000 before tonight, I said, give or take. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Your mother and I should have." He stopped. Started again. "We should have been more careful about not putting that on you." It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't everything I needed. But it was honest, and coming from my father, that meant something. The rest of the evening I spent mostly at a table near the edge of the tent, talking to my father's cousin, an older woman named Harriet who I've always liked, who asked me about my work and listened to the answers and didn't once bring up my brother's name. It was the most relaxed I'd felt all night. My brother didn't speak to me again before I left. The drive home was 40 minutes, and I spent most of it with the windows down and the radio off, just thinking. I wasn't sad, exactly. I was something more like wrung out, the kind of tired that comes after you've been holding tension for so long that releasing it is its own form of exhaustion. The text started the next morning. "My brother, can we talk about this like adults?" His wife, which surprised me because she'd barely acknowledged my existence before. I don't know what I supposedly said, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. "My mother, calling you later. Please pick up." I didn't respond to any of them that day. I made coffee, went for a walk, called my best friend and told her everything. She said without hesitation, "Good, you should have done it sooner." I told her I wasn't sure about that. She said, "You paid $22,000 for a wedding where the bride made fun of you. You should have done it much sooner." When I finally talked to my mother 2 days later, she had shifted slightly. She still wanted to smooth things over. That's just who she is. But she also said, quietly, that she'd spoken to my brother and that she thought he needed to make things right with me financially. I appreciated that. It wasn't a revolution, but it was movement. My brother called me that same week. The conversation was awkward and stilted, the way conversations are when someone is apologizing without fully wanting to. He said he'd talked to his wife about what she'd said. He said he hadn't realized how much I'd put in. He said he wanted to work something out about the money. I told him I wasn't in a hurry, but that I did expect to be paid back. Not as a threat, just as a fact. We were adults. There had been a financial arrangement, and now we needed to close it properly. "I didn't think of it as an arrangement," he said. "I thought you were doing it because you wanted to help." "I was," I said, "and now I'm done helping, and I expect to be paid back." Both things can be true. He didn't have a response to that. I started the process of pulling back that spring, not dramatically. I didn't send a letter or make any announcements. I just stopped being available the way I'd trained everyone around me to expect. When my mother mentioned that my brother was having a rough month financially, I said, "I'm sorry to hear that," and changed the subject. When my brother texted asking if I could front something small, I said I wasn't in a position to right now. I said it calmly, without explanation, without apology. It felt strange at first. I'd spent so long equating love with money, believing, somewhere underneath everything, that if I funded enough things, I would eventually earn the kind of place in the family that couldn't be taken away. What I was learning, slowly, was that it didn't work that way. The money had never bought me safety. It had just bought me a seat at a table where I was still treated like a guest. My brother and his wife moved into an apartment that spring. It was smaller than they wanted. She posted less on Instagram. I heard through my mother that the wellness brand was on pause. I didn't feel good about that exactly. I didn't want them to struggle, but I also didn't feel responsible for fixing it. Harriet, my father's cousin, called me around that time. She'd apparently heard more of the story from my father than I'd realized she'd heard. She said, "I want you to know I saw what you did for that family, and I think you've been given very little back for it." "I'm okay," I told her. "I know you are," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew someone noticed." I sat with that for a while after we hung up. It sounds small, one older woman telling me she'd noticed, but when you've spent years being invisible in the place you're supposed to matter most, Being seen by even one person feels like something you didn't know you were starving for. I started therapy that summer. Not because I was falling apart, I wasn't, but because I kept replaying certain moments and I wanted to understand them better. Why I'd kept giving. What I'd been hoping for. My therapist, who has a very calm way of asking questions that feel obvious once she asks them, said at one point, "What were you trying to make them feel toward you?" I thought about it for a long time before I answered. "Safe," I said finally. "I wanted them to feel like I was worth keeping around." She nodded like that made sense. "And did they?" I thought about my sister-in-law saying, "It's almost sad," to a table of people who laughed. I thought about my mother saying, "I hope you won't let this ruin the day." I thought about my brother saying, "You're the best, you know that," in the tone of someone complimenting a useful piece of furniture. "No," I said. "I don't think they did." That was the moment I let it go. Not all at once. Grief doesn't work that way. And what I was grieving was real, even if what I'd lost was mostly illusions. But I let myself stop trying. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped planning ways to earn back ground I'd never actually held. I bought myself a used car that fall. Nothing fancy. A Subaru with 40,000 miles on it, dark blue, reliable. I drove it to a farmer's market on a Sunday morning and bought a bunch of sunflowers and a jar of local honey and sat in my apartment with the windows open and thought, "This is mine. Just mine." My brother eventually set up a repayment plan. It was his accountant's idea, I think. Or maybe my father pushed him to do it. He pays me $500 a month. At that rate, it'll take years. But every time the deposit hits my account, I feel something settle in me. Something small and real. I still see my family at holidays. It's not perfect. His wife is polite to me in the specific way people are polite when they know they owe someone something they'd rather not think about. My mother still sometimes does that thing where she talks around a problem rather than through it. My brother and I are finding our way back to something, slowly. It's different than before, more honest, which means it's also more fragile. But I think that's okay. Some things take time to become what they were always supposed to be. I'm not the person who funds this family anymore. I'm just a member of it, same as anyone else, no more responsible for its weight than my fair share. It took me a long time to understand that wasn't a loss. It was the whole point. I used to think that keeping score made you a small person, that generous people gave without tracking, without expecting anything back, and that if I was good enough, patient enough, useful enough, the people I loved would eventually just know. They would feel it. They would return it in kind, in their own time, in their own way. What I understand now is that I wasn't being generous. I was being strategic, in a way I couldn't admit to myself. Every transfer, every deposit, every time I said, "Don't worry about it," I was making a bet. I was betting that love could be earned through usefulness, that if I made myself indispensable, I would become irreplaceable. The problem with that kind of thinking isn't just that it's wrong. It's that it quietly erodes the very thing you're trying to build. When you make yourself the funder, you stop being the sister. You become the resource. And resources don't get thanked, they get managed. What my brother's wife said at that reception, that I needed to feel needed, landed the way it did, because there was a sliver of truth in it. I had needed something, but it wasn't what she thought. I hadn't been chasing gratitude for its own sake. I'd been chasing safety. The kind of belonging you feel when you're too woven into someone's life for them to let you go. I thought money could do that. I was wrong about what money can and cannot hold together. The clarity I had sitting at that table reading the confirmation that both transfers were canceled wasn't rage. It was something much quieter. It was the moment I stopped negotiating with myself. I had a number in a spreadsheet, $22,000 in climbing, and I had a woman laughing about me 5 feet away, and I finally let those two facts sit next to each other without explaining one away. That's what I'd call wisdom, the real kind. Not the kind that sounds good in a quote, but the kind that only comes from having been wrong for a long time and finally being willing to look at it directly. It's not comfortable. It doesn't arrive with music. It just arrives, quiet and heavy, and you either turn away from it or you don't. I chose not to turn away. And then I chose to act. Not loudly, not theatrically, just cleanly. One decision. 45 seconds, no speech required. There's a kind of strength in that restraint that I hadn't known I had. Not the strength of fighting back, but the strength of simply stopping. Of deciding that the next dollar I spent on someone who mocked me would be the first dollar I owed myself an explanation for. Harriet called me months later and said she'd noticed. That one sentence did more for me than 2 years of hoping my family would come around. It reminded me that being seen doesn't require an audience. It requires one honest person. The $500 that hits my account every month now isn't really about the money anymore. It's about the record. The acknowledgement of the exchange was real, that what I gave had value, that I am not someone whose contributions disappear into silence. My brother will probably never fully understand what those years cost me, not just financially, but in the quieter ways. And I've made peace with that. I'm not waiting for a reckoning that may never come in the form I once wanted. What I have instead is something steadier, a life I built without asking permission, a car that's mine, a Sunday morning with sunflowers on the table and nobody asking me for anything. That turned out to be more than enough.